Lep pozdrav, dobrodošli vsi. Jaz sem Maša iz Inštituta za študije stanovanja in prostora in za drugatorja. In danes smo tukaj na dogodku Mesto za koga. V Atriju nas zelo prijazno gostijo knjigarna Azil, ki je tudi soorganizator dogodka. Dogodek pa poteka v okviru meseca prostora, ki ga sofinancira Ministrstvo za okolje in prostor. Zelo sem vesela, da imamo danes tako krasno omizje, ko ga imamo. Torej, z nami so Iva Marčetić, arhitektka iz zadruge ZOA, ki je tudi aktivno vključena v gibanje Pravo na grad in nasplošno v, lahko bi rekli, kontinuirano aktivistično upletena v razna gibanja za mesto in za stanovanja. In tudi v bistvu ta gibanja so nekako pripeljala do nedavne zmage Možemo v Zagrebu. Tako da bo z nami delila nekatere aspekte tega, kaj se je dogajalo in kaj se je dogajalo v Zagrebu. Potem Klemen Ploštajner, sociolog, mladi raziskovalec, ki že leta v bistvu raziskuje stanovanjsko politiko, aktivno v bistvu spremlja, kaj se spreminja in kaj se ne spreminja in se na to odziva tako v akademskem delu, kot tudi prek raznih aktivističnih gibanj. In pa Valinger, ki je pa urbanist in mladi raziskovalec na Fakulteti za arhitekturo. In danes bo nam pa on malo bolj predstavil tudi, kaj se dogaja v gibanju Ljubljana, odprto mesto. Torej, danes bi radi z gosti nekako preko neke prizme globalnih trendov prevprašali, kaj se dogaja v našem mestu, na kak način se razvija, ali je ta razvoj res to, kar potrebujemo, ali mogoče rabimo ponovno premisliti prioritete, ki se postavljajo kot glavne pri upravljanju z mestom. Govorili bomo o urbanih aktivističnih gibanjih, o lokalnih bojih, ki včasih lahko, tako kot v primeru Zagreba ali pa Barcelone, lahko pripeljajo tudi do novih mestnih oblasti. In v bistvu prevpraševali, kaj lahko storimo v bistvu kot gibanja in kako se nekako upirati tem globalnim trendom, tistim, ki se jim je potrebno. Plan za danes je približno tak. Na začetku bo vsak od govorcev predstavil nekatere svoje poudarke, ki se mu zdijo ključni za nadaljnji premislek in nadaljno razpravo. Najprej bom besedo predala Klemnu, potem Martinu in potem Ivi. Z Ivo bomo se prestavili na angleščino in bomo v bistvu preostanek razprave nadaljevali v angleščini. To mislim, da je vse, kar rabim za začetek povedati. Tako da bi kar te predala besedo, Klemen. Aha, še to. Prosim, da si kar zapomnite vsa vprašanja, ki jih imate, ki se vam vmes porajajo, ker bomo na koncu tudi odprli prostor za razpravo.
Hvala za obilo, pa hvala za organizacijo. Jaz sem si v bistvu kar en tekst pripravil. Ideja izhodišča mojega razmisleka je vprašanje javnega prostora, kar je neko od najbolj klasično vprašanje, ki se postavi pri vprašanju mesto za koga ali pa pač bolj v nekem drugem izrazoslovju vprašanje pravice do mesta. Tako da bom bral, ampak bom poskušal malo bolj interaktivno brati, tako da bom tudi kaj gor pogledal iz teksta. Udeležba prebivalcev pri upravljanju z mestom in odločanjem o njegovem prostoru je v zadnjem času postala temeljno vodilo reorganizacij mestnih uprav. Participacija, demokratizacija, civilna družba in posvetovanje in kar je še teh drugih postopkov so vpisani v temeljne dokumente tako vseh vodilnih globalnih institucij kot v večino razvojnih strategij vsakega županskega kabineta. Nazadnje to velja tudi za Ljubljano, ko smo ravno v Ljubljani. Zdaj splošna sprejemljivost teh načel, ki je bila do nedavnega, ta načela so bila rezervirana predvsem za gibanje izključenih, kliče po določeni meri sumničavosti, predvsem pa previdnosti in kritičnega odnosa do oblasti, ki se deklarativno kiti z načeli demokracije. To predvsem zato, ker je splošnost vsaj običajno povezana z popolno izpraznjenostjo vsebine ali pa gre običajno tudi ali pa pogosto samo za neke oblike simbolnih koncesij in trepljanj po rami strani oblasti. Ta previdnost je pa toliko bolj upravičena v pogojih, ko govor o demokratizaciji spremlja hkratna tendenca krčenja javnih prostorov, uničenja postojank samoorganiziranja, kot je bil primer Roga v Ljubljani, ter krepitve tržnih tendenc v mestu. Zato je pač ključen premislek pomena javne sfere in kaj so pogoji njenega obstoja. Zdaj pri vprašanju, čigavo je mesto, se običajno postavi vprašanje javnega prostora. Javni prostor bi ne predstavljal tako materialni fizični temelj javnosti v mestu, saj se v javnem prostoru odvija tisto, čemur običajno pravimo javna sfera. Javni prostor je tako dojet kot polje srečevanj, izmenjave mnenj, izražene, diskusije, se pravi oblikovanje javnega mnenja. Hkrati, to je mogoče še bolj pomembno, je pa prostor izražen na tistih, ki v običajnih bolj discipliniranih in kodificiranih segmentih javnega, recimo mediji, ne dobijo ali pa ne najdejo svojega mesta. Javni prostor tako predstavlja tudi polje vstopa izključenih in neslišanih, se pravi vstopanja kontra javnosti na politično prizorišče. Zato javni prostor ni ali pa ni vedno izraz, čemur bi liberalni ideal rekel, civiliziranega dialoga enakih, ampak je ravno prostor stika in konflikta med neenakimi. Javni prostor je zato torej predvsem vprašanje boja. Zdaj ta boj pa ne poteka samo v javnem prostoru, ampak tudi je vpet v prostor sam, se pravi, kaj je ta prostor. To je toliko bolj očitno v pogojih njegovega krčenja, ki se odvija prek njegovega nenehnega materialnega, predvsem pa pomenskega in regulatornega preoblikovanja. Tako ga po eni strani ogroža palica reda, discipline in urejenosti, to običajno vihti policija, vse pogosteje pa tudi zasebne varnostne službe. Policijska regulacija prostora je pa običajno mobilizirana za obrambo specifične ideje javnosti in javnega prostora, ki mora biti očiščen nevšečnega, neurejenega, motečega in grdega. Tarča teh očiščevalnih akcij so običajno politične zahteve, se pravi protesti, boleči opomini revščine, običajno brezdomstvo, ali pa neproduktivni izrazi zastonkarstva, se pravi neka nekomercialna raba. Po drugi strani pa se policijska disciplina dopolnjuje in pogojuje z okrepljenim poblagovljenjem prostora in podrejanjem njegove rabe po rabi. Prostor na splošno in javni prostor posebej v okviru reorganizacije mestnega gospodarstva vse bolj postaja dojet ter uporabljen kot produkcijsko sredstvo in konkurenčna prednost. Ko temelj gospodarske dejavnosti preneha biti tovarna in vse bolj postaja takšna ali drugačna poraba v prostoru in prostora samega, potem se javni prostor začne prilagajati tržnim zahtevam. Prostor postane polje meljave, pretočnosti ali dogodkovnosti, predvsem pa plemenitenja vrednosti. Kar pa je pomembno, te specifične zahteve, ki so v podobi in rabi javnega prostora in jih vsiljuje reorganizacija gospodarstva ter razrednih razmerij, je omogočena in udejanjena predvsem prek teh policijskih sredstev, ki sem jih omenil prej. To pomeni, da pač v javni prostor vse bolj vdirajo zahteve trga in države, s čimer se spreminja njegov pomen, raba in materialnost. Vprašanje javnega prostora se tako kaže predvsem kot vprašanje opredelitve javnosti, ki ima dostop in lahko uporablja prostor. Vezana je torej na vprašanje, kdo, kako in pod kakšnimi pogoji lahko uporablja ali še bolje rečeno participira v javnem prostoru. A s tem, ko si zastavimo vprašanje vstopa, se predvsem v materialnem smislu odpre pomembno vprašanje predpogojev dostopa do javnega prostora. Odkot torej vstopamo v javni prostor? Zdaj že klasična liberalna misel je javno sfero razumela kot polje, v katerega vstopajo avtonomni posamezniki iz zasebne sfere gospodinjstev. Torej je sfera javnega povezana s sfero zasebnega in je z njo na nek način tudi pogojena. Zdaj, če je pa liberalna misel običajno to vez med javnim in zasebnim dojemala zelo abstraktno, jo moramo mi dojeti materialno in kaj drugega kot je to, da je materialna podlaga zasebne sfere dostopno stanovanje. S tem, ko javni prostor povežemo z zasebnim in dostop do prvega pogojimo z obstojem dostopnosti in kakovosti drugega, se pri vprašanju obstoja javnega prostora nujno odpira stanovanjsko vprašanje. Tako se stanovanjsko vprašanje, ki je običajno dojeto kot socialno vprašanje ali pa še pogosteje mogoče kot razmerje med ponudbo in povpraševanjem, pokaže tudi kot politično vprašanje pogojevanja dostopa do javnih prostorov. Kdo in pod kakšnimi pogoji določa dostop do stanovanj, tako hkrati posredno določa tudi pogoje dostopa do javnih prostorov, s tem pa vsaj tako trdi liberalna misel in tudi, kot kaže sodobna oblast, polnopravne participacije v javni sferi in posledično v demokratičnih procesih. Torej najemodajalci, investitorji, kreditodajalci, prodajalci in agencije, pa tudi država svojo regulacijo, tako ne odločajo le o ceni stanovanj, ampak odločajo tudi, kdo in pod kakšnimi pogojih lahko postane član politične skupnosti v mestu. Odločajo torej o tem, kdo je lahko prebivalec mesta in koliko to državljanstvo tudi stane. Dostop do javnega prostora tako po pogojih tržne preskrbe stanovanj, ki je utemeljena v donosnosti posla in ne nujnosti doma, postane plačljiv in je pogojen z višino obroka kredita ali najemnine. Ta plačljivost dostopa do javnih površin in prostora kot polja participacije v politiki pa je toliko bolj perverzna, ker je obratno sorazmerje s potrebo po njem. Potreba po javnem prostoru, tako polju nekomercialne rabe kot političnega izraza ni splošna, ampak je razredno zaznamovana. To je na primer pokazal Mark Freud v svoji pretresljivi socialno-psihološki študiji Žalovanje za izgubljenim domom, Grieving for a Lost Home, ki jo je napisal v 60-ih in v katerih analizira različno dojemanje izselitve zaradi rušenja ameriških slamov v 50-ih letih. Freud pokaže, da različne skupine različno dojemajo izgubo doma, temelj razlike pa je ravno vpetost v lokalno skupnost. Ta vpetost pa je razredno zaznamovana, saj so višji sloji manj odvisni ter posledično manj navezani na okolico ter bolj potopljeni v zasebno sfero. Bogatejši se lahko pri zadovoljevanju potreb zanašajo na trg ali državo, medtem ko se morajo revnejši bolj zanašati na skupnost, solidarnost, bližnjo okolico in javne površine. Za prve, se pravi za bogatejše, je sosed vir nelagodnega jutranjega pozdrava, za druge, se pravi za revnejše, pa potencialni vir pomoči ob koncu meseca, ko porabijo plačo. Za bogate je javni prostor polje prehoda, za druge vir narave, gibanja, druženja in tudi ne nazadnje sončne svetlobe. Se pravi, za revnejše je nek podaljšek stanovanja in nujni dodatek kakovosti bivanja, za bogatejše je pa v bistvu nek prostor, običajno prostočasnega dejavnosti. In ravno tiste skupine, ki bi najbolj potrebovali dostop do javnega prostora, so tudi tiste skupine, ki so najbolj masovno izrinjene iz njega zaradi nedostopnosti stanovanj. Zdaj se pa postavlja vprašanje, zakaj dopuščamo, da zasebni interes lastnikov bank in investitorjev pogojuje dostop do javnega prostora in kaj jim daje to legitimnost in podlago. Odgovor je, da bore malo. Ne nazadnje, in tukaj je tak mogoče zanimiv poudarek, je, da tudi klasična liberalna obramba zasebne lastnine ni na njihovi strani. Liberalna tradicija je pogojevala obrambo in spodbujanje obstoja zasebne lastnine z zagotavljanjem obče koristi. Liberalni mislici so zasebno lastnino videli kot najboljše orodje za dvigovanje družbene blaginje. V ekonomskem smislu je zasebna lastnina nekaj, kar dosega najboljšo učinkovitost, produktivnost in posledično izboljša standard vseh. Tako da tudi v klasični liberalni misli obstoj in obramba zasebne lastnine nista brezpogojni, ampak sta pogojeni splošno dobrobitjo. To na zadnje poudarja tudi slovenska ustava, mogoče bolj aktualen primer pa to pokaže tudi ustavni referendum in ustavna podlaga referenduma v Berlinu nedavnega, na katerem so prebivalci podprli razlastitev velikih najemodajalcev. Lastnina prinaša odgovornost, njena raba naj služi tudi javnemu dobremu, to pravi nemška ustava. In naprej, razlastitev je dovoljena samo za zagotavljanje javnega dobrega. Torej že tudi ta liberalna misel, s katero se običajno brani zasebna lastnina in neka tudi oblastna logika, govori sama, da moč in legitimnost zasebne lastnine nista samoumevni, ampak sta pogojeni z zagotavljanjem javnega dobrega. To pa je toliko bolj pomembno pri vprašanju prostora in stanovanj, kjer so stanovanja, kot sem prej pokazal, dostop do participacije v politični skupnosti. Zdaj, to nas pa me pripelje na zaključno poanto tega mojega razmisleka, ki je povezanostjo na začetku omenjeno praznostjo zavez o participaciji prebivalcev pri upravljanju mest. Če so zaveze o participaciji resnične in iskrene, potem morajo nujno vključevati tudi vprašanje dostopnosti do javnih prostorov. Kot smo pokazali, je ta trenutno v veliki meri podrejena zasebnim profitnim interesom, ki mnoge izključujejo, druge izrivajo, tretje pa obremenijo do te mere, da nimajo ne časa in ne energije za aktivno participacijo v javnem prostoru. Degradacija javnega prostora tako ni estetska ali funkcionalna, kot si pogosto zamišljajo javne uprave, ampak je predvsem etična, saj se kaže kot nepravičnost neenakega dostopa do njega. Kakovost javnega prostora se tako ne meri v njegovi lepoti, kot bi zmotno mislil mogoče kak mestni arhitekt, njegovo oživljanje pa ne v količini kavarn ali dogodkov. Meri se predvsem v številu in raznolikosti stikov, rab in predvsem uporabnikov, ti pa, ko smo pokazali, so predvsem močno odvisni od dostopa od stanovanj. Zato za vse mestne oblasti, ki govorijo o participaciji, velja hic rodus, hic salta.
Hvala, Klemen. Ful stvari si odprl, ampak bomo počakali, da pridemo vsi skozi, ker če ne, mislim, da se lahko preveč zapletemo, tako da bi besedo kar Martinu predala, pa maske lahko damo dol. Pardon.
No, moj prispevek bo pa malenkost manj teoretski, recimo, pa bolj primeren za kakšne pisma bralcev, kot pa za konferenco, tako kot Klemno, recimo. Ampak bolj kot nek razmislek je v bistvu nek komentar ali pa opažanja stvari ali pa pač mesta Ljubljane v zadnjih letih. Naslovil sem ga pa kot ambivalentnost mestnega preporoda Ljubljane. Zdaj v zadnjem desetletju je mesto Ljubljana doživelo nov preporod. Trend povečanega izseljevanja prebivalstva v predmestja je bil uspešno zaustavljen in še nedolgo nazaj zaspano središče je bilo preurejeno v privlačno območje z živahnim dogajanjem. Nova podoba mestnega središča, prenova katerega je bila zasnovana na izkoriščanju lokalnih konkurenčnih prednosti, beri na podlagi trženja Plečnikove arhitekturne dediščine in na privabljanju novih naložb, je povečala njegovo mednarodno prepoznavnost in vsaj do nedavnega vsako leto znova prispevala k rekordnim številom turističnih obiskov in nočitev. Ponovno spodbudno gospodarsko ozračje in povečano vlaganje v gradnjo komercialnih vsebin sta v zadnjih letih rezultirala tudi v novem nepremičninskem bumu, ki pospešeno spreminja podobo in ustroj slovenske prestolnice. Zdaj po novi prepričljivi zmagi na lokalnih volitvah in vrsti mednarodnih nagrad je mestna občina Ljubljana trdno odločena, da do konca trenutnega mandata izpelje še zadnje manjkajoče projekte iz tako imenovane vizije Ljubljane 2025. In to, kot smo lahko videli v zadnjih mesecih, za vsako ceno. Dokument, ki je bil sprejet ob nastopu prvega mandata dolgoletnega ljubljanskega župana, je na novo začrtal dolgoročen prostorski in vsebinski razvoj mesta, ki pa očitno sloni predvsem na intenzivni prodaji zemljišč v javni rasti, pretkanemu poblagovljenju javnega prostora in agresivni strategiji mestnega znamčenja. Vse večje prizadevanje, da mesto postane še bolj prepoznavno turistična destinacija, danes vključuje tudi različne poskuse za povečanje kulturnega turizma in ostalih donosnejših obiskov mesta. S povečanim vlaganjem v kulturo, s podporo vse večjemu številu kreativnih dogodkov in projektov, se zdi, pa tudi v bistvu sicer neuspešno kandidaturo za Evropsko prestolnico kulture in nedavnim odprtjem cukrarne, se zdi, da si mestna oblast po zeleni titoli prizadeva za pridobitev nove in tokrat na krilih parole kreativnega mesta. Kljub temu, da vlaganje v kulturo in kreativne industrije lahko prispeva k oživljanju mesta, karkoli to pomeni, in prenovi degradiranih območij recimo, pa ima lahko agresivna politika zasledovanja perspektive kreativnega mesta tudi izredno negativne posledice za lokalno prebivalstvo, se lahko sočasno pospešujejo tudi procesi gentrifikacije in posledično izseljevanje lokalnega prebivalstva. Zdaj prvi zametki tovrstnega razvoja se v Ljubljani, v bistvu smo jih doživeli že v zadnjih 10 letih, nadaljnji pa se kažejo preko širjenja mestnega ali pa poskusov širjenja mestnega središča proti vzhodu, naprimer preko prenove Trubarjeve ulice, preko prenovljene cukrarne, kot sem že omenil, in kmalu tudi avtonomne tovarne Rok, prenove avtonomne tovarne Rok v nov design center. potem proti zahodu, recimo prenova trga mladinskih delovnih brigad kot navezava na območje Tobačne, na kateri se tudi pač pripravlja prenova, in na severu, kjer je napovedana prenova Baragovega semenišča. Uresničitev nekaterih projektov je že in bo tudi v nadaljnje botrovala umiku manj zaželenih programov v mestu in obstoječih uporabnikov, ki so trenutno v napoto umeščanju bolj donosnih vsebin v mestna območja z vse višjo menjalno vrednostjo. Molovo namero je v zadnjem času očitno pričel prepoznavati tudi privatni sektor, ki v omenjenih predelih z vedno večjo vnemo zaganja nove ali pa med krizo nasedle velikopotezne gradbene projekte, preureja poslovne prostore v stanovanjske, dosedanje najemnike pa izriva z nerazumnim višanjem najemnin. Tako obstaja resna bojazen, da bo tržno usmerjeno razumevanje vloge kulturno-kreativnih industrij v mestu v bližnji prihodnosti še poslabšalo že povečane enakosti v mestu in zatrlo številne samonikle pobude, ki temelijo na vrednotah solidarnosti, vzajemnosti in neprofitni rabi javnega urbanega prostora. Zdaj, čeprav si napori trenutne mestne oblasti zaslužijo tudi neko mero pohvale za ponovno oživitev pač mestnega središča, pa vse bolj pojasno postaja, da se ravnoteže med pozitivnimi in negativnimi učinki mestnega preporoda v zadnjih letih porušilo. Vprašanje, ki se na tem mestu zastavlja, je, ali se naše glavno mesto v zadnjem desetletju ne spreminja zgolj v peskovnik za zasebne investitorje in zabaviščni park za tiste, ki si lahko privoščijo vstopnico. Mol pa se bolj kot s potrebami tistih, ki jim mesto predstavlja dom, ukvarja s potrebami tistih, ki želijo razcvet mesta izkoristiti za lastno korist. Kljub temu, da je mestna oblast v zadnjih letih vzpostavila neke nove možnosti za vključevanje javnosti v procese odločanja, katere omenijo tudi prej Klemen, imajo pa ti še vedno zelo, zelo omejen vpliv na urbani razvoj. In namesto uvedbe obsežnejših sprememb znotraj obstoječega in zelo pomanjkljivega sistema izvajanja lokalne samouprave se MOL še naprej zadovoljuje številnimi PR kampanjami in povečano dejavnostjo na socialnih omrežjih, ki občanom dajo lažen vtis, da tudi oni prispevajo k ohranjanju podobe najlepšega mesta na svetu. V nasprotju s tem se zdi, da v bistvu vse bolj neoliberalizirani logiki vladanja v Ljubljani prostor za res demokratično razpravo o razvoju mesta postaja vse manjši, politična moč za uveljavljanje sprememb pa še naprej ostaja izključno v rokah političnih, ekonomskih pa tudi kulturnih elit. Morda je pa napočil čas, da glede tega tudi kaj naredimo.
Ja, se strinjam. Predamo kar še Ivi. So we switch to English now. And Iva, please take the floor.
Hi, I'm Iva. I come from Zagreb. I must first say that this is, I think, in 2 years, this is the first time I'm speaking in front of the full room of people. So I feel like a bit intimidated by you. No, but it's very good to see you. I apologize for speaking English. I have apologized for this so many times, not knowing Slovene. It's very weird to speak English here to you, but alas, I haven't learned it. I listened to what Martin and Klemen have talked about. My understanding of Slovene is very challenged, but I hope I will continue in their tracks in a way. What I was thinking about when Maša asked me to cover this issue, which is a very big issue, Mesto za koga, or a city for whom, I started thinking, how do you even define this? How do you put everything that you have worked around your whole life into a 10-minute talk? So I thought about an exercise that I like to do with myself when I think about the city and think about what we do in Zagreb. And that is an exercise which reminds me of a song of Kudi Idioti, of a punk band, which is called Ja sjećam se, I remember. So I do this exercise thinking about things that have happened in the city in the last 10 and 20 years. and think about how the city has looked and felt in those 20 years. I moved to Zagreb 20 years ago, and in all of those 20 years, up until this spring, I've only known one city mayor, that is the infamous Milan Bandic, who died this winter. And the only thing I could see in the city were changes which were quite, neoliberal, quite global in its trends, and quite local in its execution in a way of political parties and individuals and things like that. But quite similar probably to what is happening to Ljubljana. I remembered one of the things, because this question, Mesto za koga, kind of drew me back to 10 years ago, some 10 or 11 years ago, when we were fighting for workers of the factory of Kamensko, a textile factory, which was placed just on the fringe of the downtown area of Zagreb, which is the most central area of Zagreb. And it was placed next to the big park, to this huge park, quite large for this part of the city. And in the process of destruction of this factory, and also destruction of workers' livelihoods and things, through privatization, as they happened in Croatia so often, there was a conversation in public space, and also conversation amongst also architects, and it was sometimes difficult to convince activists also about the idea that the textile factory could exist in the center of the city. One of the arguments I remember were quite kind of hurtful for me at that time, were why would workers in a factory have a park in front of the factory? So it's like, why wouldn't they? That was the beginning of my understanding of how narratives are shaped about to whom the city belongs and what shapes those narratives. Usually, as you well know, those narratives now are shaped by the process of accumulation of capital that kind of become naturalized in our own lives. So we think that it's a very natural impulse to say, shouldn't the park be used better? In a sense, build some housing around it. But yeah, of course, for whom is this housing and who gets to live there and enjoy the park? So these questions are rarely asked and researched. This brings me to the issue of how we got involved into these issues of this factory Kamensko and other issues in Zagreb, such as the fight for the Varšavska street, the street that was actually given to a private investor, the street in the very center of the city. The fight came around, like people came around, this idea to fight for this public space and for this public property. Because youth groups and cultural groups actually in the early 2000s wanted to appropriate some of the spaces inside of the center of the city, ex-industrial spaces, squatted them, then tried to make a deal with the city and things like that. Of course, the story is very familiar. They did not succeed. They were evicted. But through that process, understood that the master plan, policies around master plan and privatization and selling of public property is something that actually is a process that kicks us out of our cities. We have, Zagreb was 20 years ago still an industrial city, in a sense that it had a lot of industry even in the center of the city. And once this industry was privatized and destroyed, a large part of this property also became city-owned property. So in that sense, one of the things that we have also fought in Zagreb, and one of the things that has created the Možemo political platform which you mentioned, is this idea to whom this property belongs, or the idea to fight for this property to be something that is going to that can be driving force for giving our city back to us, say. So we cannot return to the industrial ages of the city, or we should maybe discuss about the merits of that. But What we do have now, and I think Klemen also mentioned, was this narrative or this understanding, which is present more and more, not in just our cities, but in cities like Berlin, of course, is the idea that if you don't control, you have to control property in order to have access. So one of the things that I wanted to kind of emphasize here is, of course, that nothing can be changed in our cities if we don't control this issue, if we don't understand how this property and kind of revenue is controlled inside of our through our policies and through our politics. When I was talking about the center of Zagreb, center of Zagreb has lost 20% of its inhabitants in period from 2001 to 2011, so in the period of between two censuses. Now we have also the census of this year, which will show probably even more dire situation, and even more inhabitants gone from the central part of the city. So downtown lost, say, 20% in the first decade of 2000s, and it's probably lost a lot more in the second decade. Of course, the earthquake was a big part of that also. But also adjacent neighborhoods are losing their long-term inhabitants or people who live there. And the people in Zagreb, we have seen the migration, like huge migration from all the central neighborhoods. And this, I'm not just talking about downtown, like the central part, but all of the neighborhoods that are infrastructurally endowed, that have schools, that have trams, that have cultural facilities. They are rapidly losing inhabitants, and they are moving to the outskirts of the city. And the outskirts of the city are, of course, less endowed with infrastructure and other things that adequate standard of life requires. So this is, to come back to the beginning, this is like we have created a city in a sense that pushes that from the that actually is accepting the idea that all that we have built, the infrastructure, the parks, the schools, the services, everything, culture, that this is something that cannot belong to us, that we cannot use, in a sense, that we cannot utilize. We are moving, our migration is dictated by the price of housing, and we are moving to the outskirts, and of course the central parts are staying empty and to be utilized by somebody else. That's why any kind of power that can be built inside of our cities in that sense, I believe, could be built through, of course, political action and participation in political process, but also, in a way, representation in a sense that representation that can ensure that what we have in terms of property and which also means assets and means power, is actually distributed or planned for those who actually inhabit the city and who want to live in and work in that city. So in the end, I think this is it for the introduction.
Thank you, Eva. That was really great. Maybe I would just, because I think we all wish to discuss a lot about how to fight against these trends that are kind of, we feel being imposed on us, or we feel them coming, but they're not really something tangible. And you've all spoken about them and about the effects they bring. But maybe, Klemen, if you would just briefly go over what are we talking when we talk about maybe neoliberal urbanism, or the kind of the global trends that are being pushed in our cities, or where are they coming from, or yeah. Okay, so this is again a really, really broad question, but to answer it shortly, I think the main difference is the paradigm of how
how cities are used and for who are cities for is being changed now since 70s or 80s when it comes to the Western world, and when it comes to Croatia and Slovenia, probably not even from the 90s, but from 2000s onwards. Beforehand, the cities, and also space was understood as a space where we, as workers, would reproduce ourselves. So the main economic activities were focused in factories. That's where the focus also of the political fights were, while space was not really thought by the capital as something that it could make profit from or accumulate through space. The space was mostly used or understood as a way of reproducing labor power, so workers. So that's why the state built public housing, it built roads, it built housing, parks and stuff like that. Through different processes, the paradigm changed also from the state and also from the capital side. So since the 70s, 80s, and since 2000s in Slovenia or Croatia, state is seeing, or the cities are seeing, their economic advantages not through developing new factories, but mostly through using its space to entice new inhabitants that would spend more, or to entice tourists. So this is from the city side, so that we see it in how the public spaces are being used. When it comes from the capital, which is probably more important here because it's a prime mover, let's say, from the capital, it also became more and more interested in space as a way to profit from it. So that's why we see in the last couple of years, or in the last couple of decades, huge interest in the growth of housing markets, and also housing prices are growing now for at least 30 years, let's say, with changes in between. That's why there is more and more private investors, not only individuals, but firms investing in housing or different kinds of space, because more and more economic activities are working through space. This I think are the main, let's say, main important trends that are changing how the cities are being thought and how cities are operating. So this is really like abstractly and broadly. More concretely, probably the two examples and two statistics I think that would represent things. When it comes to housing beforehand, like in the 70s, was most of the investments came from the state. So state mostly built new housing, or from individual households. That slowly changed to private investors, and the new trend that we are seeing now is that we have more and more, not only, like I said before, like these landlords, so these individuals, landlords, investing in property, but also financial firms. So one data that blew my mind was that I think it was last year in Ireland, something like 60% of new housing was bought by international financial institutions. This is a huge change when it comes to housing. So this is one way that one data that we see how things are changing, and where the power and also the ownership of the property is changing, how this property is being used. Another, which is more of an anecdote than data, is that also in Slovenia we see these trends. They are not that huge or that big, because the housing market is operating a little bit differently. But we are now, the new real estate investment fund is being formed in Slovenia. It's called Equinox. So that what is interesting here, that the ideas that we thought of that are only existed in now United States, like big firms investing in housing, we are also seeing it in Slovenia. So this is also one, I think, like data that we could hold on and analyze from it.
Thank you. Martin, you already mentioned some of the consequences of basically these trends being implemented in Ljubljana. But so far, actually, our local government has really huge support. And it looks as though it's going to continue. So for the next election, most of us are almost expecting that Janković is going to be elected again. So what do you think that it needs to happen or needs to change or something needs to move forward in order to have this shift in thinking that, you know, the city planning is not just about the nice facades and the cultural centers and the cafes? If you would elaborate on that a bit, because also it's quite similar with what you had for a while with your previous mayor. And so maybe you got lucky last winter, or I shouldn't say it like that, but it seems like there needs to be a shift somehow also in the people or in the city or how we view the city.
Well, I think it starts with raising the awareness and the political culture of society in general, or awareness of the meaning of space, what it means. Why is it better to have a publicly accessible park or a local store in the radius of 5 minutes instead of a gated community or a shopping mall? And I think lately, we have been making some, certain groups have been doing some efforts in how to change or raise the awareness and change the mentality of people who are basically just have one agenda on their mind, and that is to have fun and to do to see the city as a place where it's cool or popular to go, and I think that the redevelopment of the city center hasn't really helped us in this sense. Okay, to one extent it has helped us in a way that we are seeing the public space as important in our lives, and that we are slowly learning to appropriate it in a different manner or collectively appropriating. But at the same time, you can see that in the periphery or outside of the city center, in our living environments, actually, we still kind of, I would say that we're still more concerned with our individual households than what is happening outside of them. So, what would have to change? I think it's really a hard question to answer to. But I think that let's say constantly raising awareness about what do different decisions in space or changes in space, what kind of consequences they have for our everyday lives, basically, I think is definitely a starting point. But if we would like to change the entire modus operandi or status quo, as I said before, I think we really need to first think of it as what kind of relationship we have to space. And I think in Slovenia it's really we're a bit behind in these terms, because I think historically we never really kind of identified with urban lifestyle completely, or we never really internalized it. So this is bringing nowadays a lot of problems also in the way that our urban policy frameworks are basically constructed, because they are more concerned with catering the needs of private investors and reacting to some external forces rather than keeping them in check or guiding them towards something that would also be in the interest of public. So I think we have we're non-experienced or unexperienced in this sense, and when you have a low awareness about the importance of space that surrounds us, I think this kind of populist agendas that mayors, not just in Ljubljana but former mayor in Zagreb and in Belgrade and in almost every other Yugoslav capital has, they can really take advantage of that. So I think with like either events like this or just like learning or emancipating, empowering basically people at the local level, I think that would definitely be a starting point.
Can I just add something? I would just like to demystify the hegemony of current mayor, because its hegemonic position derives not from his popularity, but mostly from what Ivo was talking about. So control of the networks, control of property, control of different mechanisms. When it comes to public support, the data are quite clear here. So current mayor always wins with around 60% of the vote, but when it comes to the attendance, in its first year, the attendance was something around 60%. In his second term, it was under 50, and its last term, it was, I think, the attendance at the local election was something around 35%. So there is people who are supporting current development are not the ones who are supporting current development, but are the ones who are without the concrete alternative, which is the general problem of the left. If somebody is more interesting, they should go to listen to in Cukrarna, listen Slavoj Žižek. Probably he will talk about the same things like he's talking for the last 10 years. But this is a thing that we need to think about and to know that the power of the mayors and probably for the Bandić was the same. That his strength came from the control of certain networks, not from the public support or the really keen involvement of the population of the city.
Thank you. Eva, so in order to learn a bit more in ourselves, it would be really great to hear a bit about how you kind of managed to change the narrative and with this election and to bring to power a party that stands at a radically different viewpoint or is trying to achieve really different things. So,
yeah, well, again, a big question. But I wanted to come to what Klemen was talking about, the power of mayors and the attendance of elections. I think one of the things, there's a rule, kind of, you're always going to have a similar percentage of people going to the polls. It's just a question of how many people you persuade not to come to the polls and how many new ones you persuade to come to the polls. So I guess that was the kind of middle that we struck in that sense. But you said that we were lucky because, our previous mayor died. In a sense, perhaps, but one of the things when he died, one of the things that was very present in the media, it was so silly. All of the media in Croatia were just repeating how Možemo in Zagreb i Naš, how our political platform is going to fail now that it doesn't have the main opponent, that it doesn't have somebody to fight against. But what they failed to see, that the organization was much more stable, that they understood that we kind of offered something to fight for, not just against. But in terms of like neoliberal cities and their mayors, one of the lucky things that where we are lucky and tragic in the same blow is that we have had, as you well know, the big earthquake in spring of 2020, together with lockdown and the beginning of the pandemic. So that is when the power of our mayor, his public perception came to unravel in a sense, because this is how neoliberal city is governed by the persona of the mayor, and he kind of holds these networks together. He tells everybody what to do, or I don't know. He works through different kind of deals with shady characters and networks also. But one of the things that is very global in that sense is that the cities are losing their kind of institutions. Their institutions are unraveling. They are just waiting for the dictate from somebody who is in charge. So once the catastrophe struck, you have the situation where there are no institutions left to help. it's impossible for one man to kind of resolve catastrophe situations or to help in these kind of big events. So these two natural catastrophes actually really helped propel kind of our message through the public sphere, not just in Zagreb. We had parliamentary elections where we also have our representatives in the national parliament. So, but I think in a span of very short period of time, it's just like all of a sudden everything kind of it was quite obvious that it doesn't work, and that when people needed help the most, there was no way for help to come. I'm finding it difficult nowadays to also to speak publicly, because I'm wearing kind of three hats in the same time, like somebody who works with the municipality, somebody who is an activist, and somebody who is an architect, or I don't know. But I want to tell, I just am reminded of an example of how what we have seen, what we have come to once we took over power. So in terms of housing, say. The earthquake left a lot of people without homes in Zagreb, especially from the central part of the city, and mostly what was left of those lower and middle income in the city actually were quite hit with the earthquake. So some of them, 200 of them, were placed in collective shelter, which is owned by the city, which is like a city-owned hostel. And once we came to the city offices or won the election, one of the first meetings we had was with with an office who is dealing with housing in the city. So one of the first thing that I asked them was, who is in that hostel? Who is there? Who are those people? What is their income? What is their situation? How badly did their properties got destroyed? Do they own property, or are they renters? What is going on there? And they were like, we don't know, but there is a black guy there. So the true story. So the thing that I wanted to say, like one of the first things that we had to do was send the office there and tell them to analyze who is actually in their own property living for a year and a half and in need of housing. So they did not actually at all, they did not work to understand what is going on. It is a cynical approach to whatever happens in the city. So you have 200 people homeless, place them there, don't care, 10 years, they can live there for 10 years, we don't care. They didn't even know that they were paying for it. So that is the level of not governing the city or not understanding what is going on inside of the city that is happening. So those institutions are so internally very much crumbled, and they cannot respond to what is going on. I don't know what the situation is in Ljubljana with Jankovic, I'm sure, and I hope you don't get the catastrophes as we did. But at a certain point, once those mayors, it took 20 years for this guy to go. So the power, it's like in Serbia with Vučić, it's like it's going to come to an end. The question is how. So I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe to continue a bit on this optimistic shift, I would actually like, Martin, you to say a bit about what you're doing at LOM and why, and what made you kind of become active, and what are your plans maybe a bit for the future?
I think, like in general, at least my personal interest or why am I interested in participating in this kind of initiatives in general has to do a bit with what I was talking about before, and so to give a certain support system, maybe as somebody who has been educated into this. to someone who is like experiencing some changes in their local environments, but at the end of the day, they don't know what to do about it. So how to basically put pressure out of the local communities, which keep on experiencing some things which are the consequence of, like, for example, private investors pressing on their living environments. So I think that in general, like, my personal interest, let's say, in participating in this doesn't have to be like the same for everybody. It isn't the same as someone else's. But in general, if I tell about like a couple of words about LOM or Ljubljana, Odpirajo Mesto, or what it is, or at least what it aspires to be. Like, the idea is that basically that it acts as an antipode or an antithesis to MOL. So if MOL is like working in a very top-down manner or even authoritarian manner, we would like to, see if we can collectively imagine, alternatives in the way that we shape our environments from below. So in this sense, what is maybe new for our political environment, or the way that we understand political action in city, is that it doesn't necessarily aspire to take over the position of power, but it creates a counterpower that is strong enough to force the decision makers or policy makers to change their way of operating. This might be a bit of a utopian approach, but at the same time we found that it's it gives us a certain advantage, because we do not necessarily limit ourselves to existing institutional frameworks, but we can also work outside of them. So this is a certain advantage, I think. What we're trying to do basically, on a strategic level, let's say, is to work from what is already happening in the space, or providing a platform through which different initiatives, formal or informal, individuals or groups, and also academics, professionals, and lay people even, could share their knowledge and experience on how to, basically empowering citizens to be a relevant, or to become a relevant actor in urban development, or in the way that the city is produced. So instead of like opening new fronts and pursuing our own vision, our own agenda, we would like more to work basically on a level where we could support these existing initiatives, but like adding an extra layer, which is providing long-term alternatives, which are maybe socially more just, ecologically more sound, and just democratic, more democratic. So I think, like, for this reason, we're also organizing different activities and public events. This Thursday, actually, we're organizing a public tribune close to the Plečnik Stadium in Bežigrad, and I think with this kind of events, basically, we're opening the space for a really wide discussion about the city in general and what it means to live in this city. So, like, I think we're trying to provide a space where these discussions can actually happen. We would like to expose different issues around the city, of course, but in a way that it doesn't stop at just criticizing, but actually providing possible alternatives. And I think this is like kind of the strategy that we have at the moment. Hopefully this kind of movement or this kind of idea could transform in some kind of a formidable urban movement, as it was in Zagreb and, for example, in Belgrade. But at the same time, we're also very open to being flexible in our approach and take different strategies in different situations. And I think, this is what I can say for now about it.
Klemen, in your opening speech, you really emphasized the meaning of housing as the central thing of being able to be part of the city. at all. So in Ljubljana, we see the housing is really becoming awful. So more and more people are actually going out of Ljubljana as well. And I was wondering, so far, housing hasn't been really something that could mobilize people a lot. But do you think this will kind of be maybe the where we can start to break this kind of so maybe just the right to housing in relation to the right to the city? You mentioned this all really nicely in your opening, but do you think that this will be a big fight in the future? And do you think that it has the potential to change something?
It definitely it's a kind of a shock for Slovenia in general and Ljubljana in particular, because the way we were able to live until, let's say, for the majority, until the middle of 2000s, is in a way as that housing question in Slovenia was kind of solved. Also, the state policy were formed in this way, and also as a material experience, I think that also when it comes to the household, it was also mostly, obviously not for all. We obviously had homeless people, we obviously had renters on private market, but for the majority of the population, the housing question was kind of solved because basically of good, maybe even great politics during the Yugoslavia, so in socialist Slovenia, and also then after that the privatization, so Jazbinšek law. So that's why it is now becoming kind of a shock, because it's a new thing for this particular space to be asking ourselves questions of affordability, of even dealing with the private landlord, which was mostly limited for the student population, now is becoming something more general. And because of that, I think that is what you were asking. It is certainly an interesting and important topic for political mobilization. I think it has a lot of potential, but it is the question, I think it's still kind of limited for a particular population. It's not that general as in Berlin, probably. We cannot expect mobilization at that level because we don't even know how many people are renting in Ljubljana, but let's say kind of 20% of people who are living in Ljubljana, we could say that they are renters, while in Berlin the percentages are, I don't know, something about 70 or 80, something like that. So we cannot expect the political mobilization to be as big, but I think it can be a really important topic, but again, it is important how it will be framed and if there will be I would say, organized power behind a certain idea. Because mostly it can easily be framed as a question of supply and demand, and it can easily be framed as something that the state can solve by just building a couple of hundred, maybe even 1,000 public units, which state is now doing, not the current government, but let's say institutions like housing fund, and also municipalities also doing that. If it's framed in that way, then I think there is not a lot of political potential in the housing question. But if it's framed in a way that Eva was also mentioning, the question of power, the question of property rights, question of relations between investors and the city, owners and renters, then it has a political potential, but not only in a way how the election works, so for the election cycle, but also for the more this, how to call it, grassroots organizing, so building proper political power from this, what Martin was talking about, so this community organizing. So I think, yes, so to answer shortly, there is quite a lot of potential, not as much as we would hope for when we are looking at Barcelona, Berlin, England, Glasgow, Ireland, or something like that, or New York. but it depends on how, what kind of questions will be asked when we were talking about housing, and who will be asking these questions. Would it be renters, or will it be people who just want to buy a home more cheaply?
And do you just think that this circumstance that a lot of the property is still being owned by individual owners is maybe in this circumstance an asset in maybe, you know, in terms of trying to keep this, or at least some part of the control over property and the land? Mm-hmm. Or do you think we could use this in some way? Or
what Ivo was talking about when we were talking about that those 200 people living in a hostel, it made me think about that. What is similar here with Ljubljana is also that we as people who are researching the topic of housing, not even the municipality, nobody knows, like I said, what is the exact housing situation in Ljubljana, or how the ownership is structured in Ljubljana, so ownership of housing mostly. So we don't know how many people are renting, we don't know what's the average height of the rental agreement, so the rent, we don't know the average length of the rental agreement, we don't know if we have like big landlords with 20 apartments, or we only have retired ladies who are just trying to be living their lives by renting a housing to poor students. So we don't know what the concrete situation is, and even city doesn't know what the concrete situation is, which is similar case if the city doesn't know how city looks, if the mayor doesn't know how the city operates concretely, how he or the municipality can then govern it in a useful way for its citizens. So it's kind of hard to answer the question that you asked, because we don't know, but there is a feeling that and there are some signs that things are going more into the direction of concentration of property. But this is a general trend, not particular for Slovenia, but general trend, and it's also part of the first question that you asked me. So the neoliberal reorganization of society, so concentration of power and ownership and property in the hands of the small minority. But this, like I said, this concentration in Slovenia is not that high or critical as it is in other countries, but we can see where it can lead when we look at different countries that have more concentration ownership structure.
So Eva, I would really like to ask you, when you come to power after such a mayor that has really destroyed basically the structures of governance and so on, what can you do, and where are the limits, and what are you trying to achieve? Like, I know another big one.
No, it's just like the limits are many. Okay, before I get into that, I would like to address also, I liked Klemen's question better, so. I would like to address that because I have been thinking about it, of course, a lot, about the question of how potent the housing question is in our cities for activism and for building political power. And usually, like, we have almost the same situations, especially about the data thing, and that is on purpose. That is completely on purpose. It's not something that they forgot, that is forgotten to be measured. It's on purpose. If you measure population by households living in their own property, and you count that every grown member who is living in the house is an owner, not just like parents are the owners and kids are living there. If you count everybody like that, if you make a statistical data like that, you get the political situation that you get. You get 90% of house owners and things like that. But in terms of building political power, I think we are usually we usually have our eyes, have our eyes on situations in Berlin or in Barcelona or I don't know, in New York for that matter. But the housing question, as we know, is extremely global and extremely local. So you cannot transfer totally experiences or your expectations. For me, it's like when we work in this activist and research manner, anyway, like in the activist, trying to get people together to work on their problems in their interest in terms of housing. When you try to get tenants to work together, it is a very difficult job to do. But when you talk about housing, everybody's interested and everybody's listening. So one of the things that we, I think, do best in Croatia, where we have found a way to somehow kind of push through, is more media activism in that sense. Like we are more present in the media and talking about these issues that are quite familiar to many people. So we are seeing the mood change in public speech about this. Like I cannot imagine. I just read yesterday an interview with a guy who's an owner of a real estate company and also president of some kind of society of I don't know how to call them, like a society of firms and business people, something like that. So he says that one of the question was about housing, about the rising prices of housing in Croatia. We have this situation where foreigners are buying a lot of property in our country, especially in Zagreb and on the coast. And we have a situation where people from Croatia are usually buying small apartments of 40 to 50 square meters, which is quite dire when you think about the housing standard. And he says, the main problem is that we don't have housing policies, we don't have measures like social measures, we don't have institutionalized rent, we don't have enough of public housing, we cannot let the market do everything. So housing cannot be let to the market. It's not. So it's amazing to see somebody from that spectrum of political life or public life to talk about these things, but it's present more and more. So one of the things that comforts me in a sense is that this issue is something that is more and more discussed and more understood, and the narrative is kind of built. So my kind of hope is that in a political sense, now I go back to the question, in a sense of being in some kind of political power, that you will have support for policies that are of decommodifying housing type. But that is very difficult to do also. And the question is also one of the things that, we were talking about this individual landlords, baby boomers who are killing us with their rents and things like that. One of the things, if we try to regulate the housing market, in that sense, nobody politically wanted to get into this hot potato kind of, because they have to, politicians that will have to change the narrative that has been very present for the last 30 years, and that is nobody touches my private property. So even when you talk to tenants, it is one of the things that when we gather tenants and when we talk about with them, one of the hardest thing to mutually understand is that a landlord does not have the power over your life if he's an owner of an apartment. You have a power to, you have every right to do in your apartment whatever you want, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. But these things, to understand that somebody cannot ask their property to be kind of let out. How do you say? I'm losing my English now. So one of the things that I usually, when the people from the media, when they started asking these questions in the beginning, when we started pushing towards more media action around the housing issue, one of the things that was always asked was But how can you regulate how much somebody wants to rent their apartment for? Or how can you regulate if they want to evict somebody? So concepts like that are not understood. One of the things I used to say is like, but there are laws, and it's not like you can kill a man on your private property and then not be responsible to the state or to the power or whatever. It's not something that, you know, if something is your private property, is not something that can be used and abused in that sense that when it hurts other people. So yeah, I don't know. One of the things that I hope in this sense that could be possible is building up kind of this political representation in that sense, and getting into this fight of understanding that there are limits to using private property.
Thank you. At this point, I would really like to open the floor also if some of you have any questions. There's a mic going around. Oh, already, okay.
Eva, I want to be very pragmatic. You mentioned that Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You mentioned that the organizational structure of Možemo was more resilient than everyone thought. And can you elaborate on how did you build this resilience, and how did you move from an activist group to a winning political party?
I think sociologists and politologists or whatever are going to analyze this for years to come, but I'm not of that education, but I can say that for Zagreb, one of the things I can say is that we have, like, there was a very consistent and very resilient urban movement in Zagreb, and people who are around Možemo and us who created Zagreb je naš and later Možemo had certain kind of a street cred in a sense, like we were present in the city many years before. We were kind of trusted and things like that, but there is also one of the things that I think is quite important to understand, like mostly in like kind of leftist circles, is like trying to create a stability through finding like the points where we agree rather than disagree, in a sense of creating networks. So creating like Možemo, or like we have created kind of a platform. It's very complicated to understand, but it's actually something that has brought not just people but other political parties inside. So it has happened through trying to search for those like points of where we converge and kind of build up power from that and build on those issues where we agree, I think.
Is there another question? No.
Yeah, so I have a question for all of you, I think. I mean, in terms of forming new institutional frameworks for like transcending one of these root causes of the problem being the selling of public land to the private investors, what do you think of participatory budget, and how would we go about achieving it?
Participatory budget?
Budgeting, yeah.
I hate it. No, of course not. That's one of the things we have in our program too. It depends, like participatory tools like this are quite, I think are quite interesting and can be explored more. It's just the question, well, I have a problem sometimes with using participatory tools as the panacea for everything, because some of the things are not not discussed. When you have, for example, I can explain it maybe better in spatial terms. When you have like participatory planning, which is understood as people get together and then they plan. I always thought that concept to be very flawed, because in that concept you get situations where those who are loudest or who work most are the ones who get more of what they want. Also, there is like complete kind of not acknowledging that there is some kind of knowledge in a society that needs also to be used and utilized, and that in order to discuss something, you have to understand something. So it's not about education per se. Say, for example, when we once worked with people in one of the parks where we had a huge fight against the church, we worked with people in participatory planning. So one of the things that they said, we asked them, what do you want? And they wanted separate space for kids, separate space for dogs, and separate space for pensioners. So the first thing we asked them, so what happens if a grandma takes a grandson and a dog to the park? So what do? So it's like, it's also, one of the things that needs to exist also is more communication in that sense. There needs to exist more public forums, more understanding of issues in order to have truly participation in political and then all other processes. Sorry, this took too long.
Yeah, if I may just add on that, I think what you just mentioned is really crucial, because like instead of putting all the responsibility or majority of responsibility to the civil society, let's call it, or local communities, and saying, you know what's best for you, I think maybe that's not the right approach. And also importing ideas or solutions that have worked somewhere else will not necessarily guarantee that they will work here as well. So I think what is more important is to really like kind of start fostering a political culture that also knows how to negotiate and also knows when to back off, not just demanding all the time, what they think is their right. And I think that here in this region in general, I think like the level of political culture is still on that there, that we just think that, the freedom is, what we want, and if we don't get it, it's not fair to us. So maybe I think, that more than like looking, I think participatory budgeting is definitely a useful tool, but I think it should be a stepping stone to something, that is much more democratic, and often it seems that when you implement tools like that, they become an end to themselves. So
I'm sorry if I can only also add, it's one of the things that we forgot how to do, and our institutions forgot to do, to have a clear understanding of measuring needs before you implement something. For example, like we are talking about, participatory planning of a park, but they're like, or a neighborhood, but nobody is measuring how many people, as we said, how many people are renters there, how much do people pay for housing, what are the needs of people in that sense. Like nobody is questioning this side, not nobody, we have no more institutional framework that kind of can sufficiently measure this. It's also like in participatory budgeting, it goes like for small pieces of budget in, say, neighborhoods, which is cool. But then, you're, as somebody, like you're offered a very small part, and you have been offered very defined part of what you can do. So it's also like,
it seems like a good excuse not to involve the public in anything else. Also, like
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be disparaging towards the concept. I think, it's a good tool. But I think we also need to think that there is just like no, this objective knowledge of people that are just living somewhere and that are just. We have to measure needs, and we have to understand them through also political prism.
But also involve people in other decisions and the level of the city.
Yeah. No, I would be a little bit more positive. I would say that it's an extremely useful tool and interesting tool with its limitations that were also stated, but I think that it's a useful tool also for the reasons that Eva mentioned and Martin mentioned are its limitations. So it's a useful tool also for gathering information to understand how things are working, to understand what is happening in certain areas, and also an important tool for let's say political education also, and also for the education of how to build communities. But I would also add another limitation. First one is that Eva I think mentioned. It was that we also need this let's say enlightenment and rational governing body that tries to let's say plan certain things more broadly, that it cannot be understood from let's say spontaneous way how we use our cities or live in the neighborhood. And the second thing is, I think that one of the limits of when we were thinking about participation, that we are also need to think that I think that the main political goal is to liberate our time, so to have more free time. And this free time, it is what it is in politics, that freedom is an endless meeting. So political participation means that we would have more meetings and discuss and stuff like that. But on the other hand, we cannot develop a system when we will go from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting and discuss everything. The goal of the systems that we organized need to go in the direction to liberate as much time as possible to live, to do things that we really enjoy doing. So I think this is also one, let's say, organizational flaw of participation.
If I may just add something, the experience or the Slovenian experience of participatory budgeting or the model is also going to be discussed in the public tribune on Thursday that I was mentioning. So if anybody is interested to hear more about how this kind of budgeting has been implemented in different municipalities in the country, you're kindly invited to come. And I think, like, also for me, it's something that I'm not really familiar with in details. So it's going to be interesting, I think.
Is there another question?
I have more of a comment about the data. Some of the data does exist, but the problem is because the state lacked to organize any useful analytical tools, the private sector took up what was left. So we have a few companies in Ljubljana that analyze data of who lives where and what are the prices of apartments and how that works. Yeah, just a comment.
Yeah.
I would also like to comment on something. If government would only give people affordable rent by making new housing, all the new housing is made by kind of modernistic approach of urbanism, and they are not actually creating new streets. They are making new roads with new parkings and new blocks of flats, but all the streets will remain in the city center, owned by private investors, and people are not owning the streets. They are just paying rent for just apartments. So if you can comment on how could we build more streets and less roads and less just islands?
I'm an architect, so I should answer this. I mean, we for sure need better urbanization. We are, like, for Zagreb, I could say, and probably the case here also, when we build new housing, like public housing, which is very scarce, but we have, like, in the last 20 years built 1.5 neighborhood of public housing. We built, as Raquel Rowling says, like with simultaneous tools of neoliberalism and socialism. So when it comes to urban kind of design. So not to get into the roads and streets discussion, I think it's a broader kind of urban planning discussion, but I would say that when kind of planning for new public housing, what is important is to, because of the situation we have today and the problem with gentrifying certain areas, we have to think about dispersing this public housing throughout different areas in the city, and be very careful not to build ghettoized kind of situations, which then asks for very different models than what we have today.
I think, like, in the last couple of years, I wouldn't say that public housing, even in Ljubljana, like the projects that were actually realized, that they're just, having this modernist approach. Like the neighborhoods in Brdo, especially the first one, I think it's also creating, from like a perspective of urban design, it's also creating a space that it's, that people are appropriating, and where kids have space to run around, and there is enough maybe sitting places, and it's thermally comfortable and so on. I think maybe the next step would be like also to start thinking about what's happening in ground floors of these neighborhoods, because like the idea of let's say commercial activity is the one which generates the vibrancy or attracts people to use the public space. I think to some extent it holds, even though there will probably have to be parallel policies about who owns these spaces, and that they're not used for just a private profit, but that they are actually placed and managed in a way that they could actually contribute to the community that is living there. So, but because of, like, if we want this, we first need to see, well, what is the existing bureaucracy and the urban policy that deals with this. And I think right now our urban policy framework is really limited to basically the percentages of greenery and how much it can be built, and like urban indicators that are easily manipulated with when enough money is in question.
I think we've exhausted the questions. Oh no.
I have just one question. I got microphone, so I will use it. I would like to ask all of the panelists, what do they think if we would need a little bit more of also educating people about the housing problem, meaning not young, but not only young people, about how to think and solve their housing question, because now, I don't know, I'm looking for the perspective of my region, from Gorenjska region. We just think that, okay, we should get enough money to buy apartment or something like this, or maybe we should be lucky to have a grandmother who give us money. But on the other hand, so maybe that I think that people still don't have enough knowledge and like experience, some fresh, open mind, how to solve their housing problem, and also how to, also to cooperate with other people with similar problem. And on the other hand, also, I think also it would be useful to educate a little bit landowners, landlords. I mean here those who have a little bit of heart still. Because it's also for them, for some of them it would be useful from the moral point of view, and also from the point of view of their ownership, because it's not always the best solution to get someone who will bring you the biggest rent. Maybe this is short-term solution, but on long term it can be harmful.
Yeah, I think that what you were asking is definitely one part of the issue and one part of the activities that should be done. And it also answers the question about the participation that we asked before, because presumption, yeah, of your question was that people do not know what the all options are, therefore they're not able to rationally decide what's good for them. Just to return to the previous discussion about participation, but yeah, certainly because of how the housing market is structured, how the options are also discussed in media beforehand or from the traditional point of view. Majority of people have a quite limited understanding or ability to grasp what the options are, which is this level of the ideas, but also on the material level they are quite limited, because in Slovenia, to actually solve your housing question concretely and for a long term, and also probably similar in Croatia, is to become a non-profit renter in public housing, which is now also a little bit shaky because we have certain reforms that are leading to higher rents, and there are certain discussions what will happen with public housing. So the only possible way is to become a homeowner, and you are free from not free. You are not free from the bank, but you are in a certain way. The only way to concretely solve it. So we need to connect this, let's say, education level with also discussion about how housing systems are operating and what alternatives and possibilities are. Because right now, currently, it would be even not irrational, but also immoral for educators, let's say, to propagate private renting or renting even in a regulated way, because it means a lot of things for the households. But I agree that it is really important to discuss. To change the narrative, what Ivo was talking about before. So how to think about housing, what's the idea behind it, what are the different possibilities, what are different systems, who are the actors on a housing market, and to change a little bit the perspective. But this perspective is useless if it's not backed by also the different regulatory system. It would only lead to frustration. Or to the different idea how the housing markets and housing system is operating. Without that, we will be just utopian discussing how the world can be, and building the frustration in ourselves also, and in the people who we will be discussing with.
But maybe, Klemen, because you didn't, and I think you should, just for starters, you should tell people that they should just go on Najemniški SOS and write their stories and get educated about their rights on renting, and and organize then from this step forward. So hopefully sometime soon in the future. Does one of you want to also reply?
One of the things we have done was we worked with tenants. We called them for workshops, and then what we did like a booklet on tenants' rights, where we analyzed the law, and it's very readable. It's very kind of all of the things that main things that are bother people in this kind of relation are there in the booklet. It's available. It's something that we also push through the media to be found. So there is like this point of just not just educating from a point of somebody who knows laws, but kind of mutual education also. Understanding what happens in the field is also very important in creating this kind of what you would say education. But I would say like that. This is not like people. I think people are quite aware of how dire situation is and how badly they are living, especially younger generation that is now up to 45 years old. are quite aware of their situation. And one of the things that is quite important also to know is that, you know, what we do need and what we do desire is safety of housing, safety of our housing status. And those who provide safety of our state, who provides safety of our status is actually the state. So if state is writing laws and policies that only favor or only make you safe in your private property, then they are not guaranteeing safety in rental apartments, in cooperative apartments, in any other kind of housing status that you have. So without changing this situation where security is written in the laws and is executed, and those laws are executed, or to have this kind of a legal change and legal power, we cannot talk about alternatives. Alternatives are not there. We don't have alternatives to having like private property or huge debt. Or actually what we do have is like we have states where our housing question is resolved by our families. And whoever does not have a family or does not have a family who can resolve their housing issue is very possibly going to be poor or is going to, in the end, become homeless. So this is not something like, this needs to change, where state is actually where it can guarantee our security of housing and where it can kind of create alternatives.
Okay. Now I think we've been really long, so maybe we should just sum up by saying that in order actually to be able to provide a city for at least most, we need to start thinking about what we do with our land and what we do with city land, and actually LOM is doing right that. So a week ago or two, there was the open letter not to sell any more municipal lands. And so I think this is a really good starting point for anyone who wants to get active to as Martin already mentioned twice, join the assembly on Thursday. And hopefully this will bring us to a much nicer city that will be much more inclusive. Thank you to all three of you. If one of you has a really quick punchline, that is welcome. Otherwise, thank you to all of the guests. And I think we will discuss some more in a less formal setting.